this video, I'll talk about kneading, and then I'll demonstrate mixing up a dough and kneading it. The process I follow is to mix all the ingredients except for the salt. And I say mix them, get them incorporated so there are no dry spots, but don't start kneading yet. Then I let that mixture sit for 15 to 30 minutes. And this is a rest period. You might hear it called the autolyse. And it does a few things. So during the autolyse, the hydration proceeds, meaning that the water molecules work their way into the starches and proteins. The pH of the mixture falls, which causes proteins to unravel, and all the different enzymes become activated. And as a result, the dough will be a little less sticky after the rest period. And if you do need to make adjustments to how much water is in there, it will be easier to adjust, having given the dough some time for everything to balance out. And also, because of the enzymes that have gotten to work in there and the acidity falling, the gluten proteins will sort of be poised and ready to start forming that network we talked about in one of the previous videos. So overall, similar to with the peppermint, this rest period will make your dough a little bit easier to knead to the fully kneaded state. So one important point, especially if you're a beginner and you haven't done this too much, is that when you start mixing up your dough, you want to err on the wet side. And the reason is that it's much easier to move from a dough that is too wet to a good dough than from a dough that is too dry. So if your dough is too wet, it will be really messy, it'll stick to your hands, and it'll be hard to work with as you're kneading. It also might not rise as high because it just sort of gets heavy, and in the oven it might not puff up as much. On the other hand though, a wetter dough will have more flavor and it will have more open hole structure. So if that's what you're going for, you might want a dough that's a little wet. If your dough is too dry, it will be really tough and thick and very hard to knead. I call it the dough brick because it's just like super hard to knead, and it's really hard to knead it properly when it's too dry. And then also the dough itself is going to have trouble expanding because it's missing that flexibility of a wet dough. So, there are some pros with a wet dough, but there really aren't any pros with a dough that is too dry. And so you just, also once you have that dry dough, you can try adding water to it, but you'll often just end up with a sloppy mess of water and dry dough bits. So it's just very hard to work water into there once you have the dough brick. So just always err on the side of too wet because it's easy to add more flour and make your dough a little bit drier. So there are two methods you can follow when you start mixing up your dough. The first one, which is the way I learned to do it, is to start with all of your flour and then add most of your water and hold a little bit back and start mixing it up, but you have to be very, very careful to make sure you don't start getting into that territory where it is too dry. As you assess it, if you think it feels dry, you add the rest of the water. The reason this method exists is because sometimes the hydration of a recipe can change. So you get a new batch of flour in and the moisture content in the flour is a little higher, and in order to adjust the recipe you would have to withhold a little water. But this is how I learned to do it, but it's a little bit dangerous because you can easily end up in that too dry territory. And if you do this, you have to be really careful to always be feeling the dough, making sure it's still flexible and making sure it's not getting too dry. So the second method would be to use all your water and withhold a little bit of your flour. And this way you don't run the risk of getting into the place where your dough is too dry. What might happen though is that you end up adding all the flour and then you need to add a little bit more flour than what your recipe calls for to make up for the dough being a little too wet. And so I will follow the second method today when I do my demonstration. I want to apologize for the weird camera angles. If you haven't figured it out, I don't have anyone to hold the camera for me. So it will probably fall over as soon as I start kneading. Okay, so here is all of the water, and it is 65 degrees. And then this is the poolish. This is actually now 2 days old. I didn't have time to bake yesterday, so I just put it in the fridge when it was fully risen, but it still looks bubbly, it still smells good, and so I think it should be all right. I am going to add an extra pinch of yeast to the recipe just in case the poulish is a little bit less lively than it would have been if I had used it yesterday. And then here's my flour, and again, I'm not going to add all of it. I'm just going to add most of it. And so for my yeast, right here, it's instant yeast, but whether it were instant or active dry, I'm going to, let me see if I can show you this, just kind of pour it into the flour and then mix it up into the flour so that when it hits the water, it's sort of protected. Not that my water is that cold or anything, but that's how I do it. Just mix the yeast into the flour. So now I'm just going to mix with my hand, and I do that kind of just starting with this scrunching motion because I like to keep an eye on how wet the dough is and how flexible the dough is, just to always avoid ending up in that danger zone where it is too dry. If at any point it starts to feel dry or stiff, I would want to stop and add more water. Also remember that I'm not kneading right now. I am just incorporating the ingredients, so I don't want to go overboard with the kneading. I'm just going to incorporate the ingredients and then stop and have my rest period called the autolyse. So this is pretty wet, so I'm going to go ahead and add most of the flour. If the gobs of flour on my hand start to get too annoying, take my scraper and just scrape my hand off. This is also useful for just scraping the sides. If sometimes you end up with dry flour on the sides or on the bottom, you can scrape and kind of fold the dry parts into the wet parts. So there are still a few dry patches, but I think this would be a fine place to stop for the rest period. This dough is it's pretty sticky and pretty wet, but it's nice and soft and flexible. So I have a feeling we're going to end up adding all of that flour, but I'm just going to stop right here and let it do the rest period. And then because the water will hydrate the proteins and the starches during this rest period, I'm going to wait and see how it feels after the rest period before I add any more flour. But I do. So then cover the bowl. You can use plastic wrap. I usually use just a damp towel to avoid creating waste, just so it doesn't dry out. And I'm going to set a timer for 15 or maybe 20 minutes. So while we wait, let's talk about kneading. Kneading takes energy, and some people find it really relaxing or meditative, and they just really enjoy doing it. I am not one of those people. To me, kneading is just a lot of work, and I want to do it and get it over with. So it's tempting when you're kneading, if you're like me, to just keep stopping and resting and taking a break. And if you do that, you keep taking breaks and your dough is not getting kneaded, which makes the process just take longer and longer. So I often will set a timer and I'll tell myself, I'm not going to stop until the timer goes off. Or sometimes I will play music and I'll tell myself, okay, I'm going to go for 4 songs before I stop. And that's just a way to keep myself going without taking those breaks. Sometimes when you're kneading, even if you have a dough that's the perfect consistency, it sometimes will still stick to your hands while you're kneading or start sticking to the surface you're on. And the best way to fight that is just to keep moving, because if you knead fast, it just won't have time to stick. So that's another reason to keep going and to not keep stopping and taking a rest. So a lot of people will ask, how long do I knead for? One time a baker told me, I knead until the sweat is rolling down my arm, and right when it's about to drip into the dough, that's how I know when I'm done. So I thought that was funny, but that's not what I do. I use a test called the window test where I stretch the dough, and the idea is you should be able to stretch it out, creating a nice thin sheet of dough that is so thin light can shine through it without the dough ripping. So that's what I'm shooting for. When I'm kneading by hand, I rarely get a very nice window before I am sick of kneading and ready to quit. And so I usually do quit before I reach that stage, and I think that's okay. Later in the process, when you do a punch down and fold, that's a chance to add a bit of extra strength to your dough. And then again, when you're shaping, if you shape nice and tightly, you're adding strength to your dough, and that will help your dough expand and stay upright and expand up in the oven. Yes, if I needed longer, I'd probably get a nice, more open hole structure inside my final bread and a bit more expansion. But at this point, I usually just am ready to move on from kneading after, maybe 10 to 15 minutes of it. So I often quit. You can keep going till you get a perfect window, or you can be like me and do as much as you can. So another question is, where is the best place to knead? Any table or countertop will work as long as you clean it. One thing to consider is that you want to be at a comfortable height. So for me, it would actually be better to have a surface about here, so that when I'm kneading, my arms are coming out and you're not like too high and hurting your back or having to bend too low. But the butcher block that I usually knead on is on wheels, and it moves a bit too much for the camera. So I'm going to use my kitchen table today, and it will probably still knock the camera over at least once. But yes, you want a comfortable height. If you don't have a surface that seems good enough, one thing you can do is take a damp towel and just kind of put it out. It doesn't have to be totally flat. Put a cutting board on top of it, and the towel will kind of hold the cutting board so that you can knead and it won't slide as much. You can also use just a very large bowl. So pretend this bowl is bigger, and you kind of just hold the bowl with one hand, and with your other hand, flip the dough and push and do a kneading motion while keeping it all in a bowl. So that's another solution if you don't have a good surface. So I'm going to start by adding my salt, which I weighed out ahead. Just kind of sprinkle it on there, and it will get mixed in as you need. This dough, it's still pretty sticky, so I'm going to add a bit more of, this is the amount of flour that was in the recipe, so I'm just going to sprinkle that on. I have a feeling we'll end up using all of it and perhaps a little more. And then I'm going to use this to work that flour and salt in so that, and again, I'm just scraping and pushing. Ideally, you want to get your dough to the right hydration, the right consistency before you start kneading, so that you don't have to keep stopping and adding flour. So again, this still feels pretty sticky, so I'm going to go ahead and add all the flour, and then we might even need a little bit more. One thing is that kneading involves a lot of different types of balance, I think about. It feels really good when you add flour and it kind of dries up the dough a little bit, but you have to be careful because if you keep adding flour, you'll end up drying it out too much. So that's one balance. And then I said earlier that you have to put energy and work into kneading, but at the same time, you don't want to be mauling the dough. You don't want to be like ripping it and tearing it up, because you can overhandle it and end up adding too much heat to it, and it just can become more and more messy. And then another thing I think about is hand cleanliness. So right now my hands are pretty clean. I'm going to start kneading, and probably the dough is going to stick to my hands and they're going to get really messy. And I'll usually stop once and clean them off and adjust the the wetness of the dough a little bit. But you don't want to be stopping every 2 minutes and cleaning your hands. You do have to get used to having just a little bit of dough on them and just ignore it. So if there's too much, if your hands are all gobbed up with sticky bits of dough, the dough you're trying to knead will keep sticking to your hands worse. So I advocate cleaning them once, maybe twice, but you don't want to keep stopping and doing it every minute just as an excuse to take a break from kneading. Okay, so my dough is still a teeny bit sticky, but we're gonna get going. I usually just sprinkle a little flour down so I don't immediately stick to the table. And there's my dough. Okay, and so there's all different motions you can use. A real common one is sort of take one side and fold and then push, turn, fold again, push. That's kind of what I do, just to keep, I kind of like it because it keeps your dough always in this sort of ball shape. I've seen people take it and slap it on the table. I didn't do that too hard. I've seen this weird, well, not weird, sort of a cutting motion where you take your thumbs and cut with the dough. So there's all different ways to do it. And I would just say find the one that works for you. I usually sort of brace my legs because I know that I have more lower body strength than upper body strength. So it's kind of like your whole body is behind the force of your hands, not just your arms. If you, like me, do not have super bulgy arms. You want to think about that you're kneading sort of the whole ball of dough, not just like pushing on a little bit or pushing on one side, but really a motion where the whole thing is getting pushed on. So I think it's still a little bit sticky. I'm going to take that break and wash my hands, and then I'm going to show you how to add a little bit of flour without overdoing it. So a good way to add just a little bit of flour to your dough without overdoing it is kind of coat your hands in flour and just keep kneading. And so you've added just a tiny little bit without really going overboard. Like if you sprinkled flour on, you might add too much. So this dough, you can see it's like flexible and stretchy, but it's no longer really sticking to me. So I think this is the hydration we want, and we're going to try to just keep kneading and not add any more flour to it. This would be the point where you put a timer on or some music on and knead without stopping. So I just kneaded, I played a WUNC podcast for 20 minutes. While I was kneading, my dough did start to feel really, really sticky a few times. So I added a little bit more flour, maybe 3 or 4 times, and I did have to admit I did wash my hands twice more, which is why they're pretty clean. But here's my dough, and this is the window test. So you take your dough and you try to stretch it. And the idea is that you can get it thin enough that light is shining through it without it starting to rip. So I think that's a pretty good window. Actually, I'm sort of amazed. I don't usually get that nice one. You can see it just started to rip there. So maybe I could keep going a little longer, but I think 20 minutes is enough. So don't worry if you don't have a perfect window. You'll have more chances to add strength later in the process. And I know it might feel hopeless because you feel like, well, I worked as hard as I could and I didn't get a window. But it's not actually that you have to work harder next time. You just sort of become more efficient the more you knead, and being more efficient means you knead your dough better with the same amount of work, and then you will reach the more fully kneaded state. So finally, just a few things to do now that we're done kneading. I like to take my dough's temperature, and ideally you're gonna feel your dough, and when it feels gassy, you'll move on to the next step. But I just like to kind of know where it's at. So I usually take it in two places. I push it in, let the thermometer adjust, and then I put it in a new location so that I'm getting an accurate reading. And it's hovering around 71. It's getting up there a little bit. Ideal is 75, I know would be ready in about an hour. This is pretty stuck at 71. So I'll probably just put the dough in a slightly warmer location, such as maybe up on top of the refrigerator or somewhere high up, just to speed it up a little bit. And then I also might wait an hour and 10 minutes instead of an hour. So what to do with your dough? I will sometimes put it in a bowl with a little bit of oil underneath. Today I was just going to use this container because it has a lid and it's easy. The oil is optional. If you want to use it, it just makes it easier to get your dough out later in the process. I just add a teeny little bit and then kind of smooth it around all the different sides. Remember, the dough is going to be rising, so you want to have the oil up higher. So the oil is optional. If you don't want oil mixed into your dough, feel free to leave it out. When it's time to do the next step, you might have to get a scraper and kind of scrape the dough out of the bowl because it will have stuck to the sides. But I'm just going to plop it in there and cover it. If you have it in a bowl, you could cover it with plastic wrap or a damp towel. So like I said, it's a little cold, so I'll probably put it maybe on top of the fridge. If it had turned out a little on the hot side, you might put it, down on the floor. It would be cooler. And this also depends on your house temperature. So my house is 65 right now. So again, I want to put it a little bit higher, but if it were summertime and your house was 80, you might want to go down on the floor. I've met people who do, I would say, more extreme measures. You might, if your dough is cold, you might shine a desk lamp on it to warm it up. I've seen people take one of those large plastic tubs and create a sort of a homemade proof box where there's a bowl of boiling water in there on one side and then your dough on the other side rising. And so it's this nice, warm, steamy environment that you create at home. Another reason to know the dough temperature is so that I can make adjustments for next time. So because my dough was, I said 71 degrees, I might use water that's a few degrees warmer next time, knowing that kneading in my house this month doesn't add as much heat as I thought it did. So one final point is if you want to add any special ingredients to your dough, such as chopped up olives or rosemary or raisins, the time to add them would be at the end of the knead, so right now before you put it in that tub. Basically, you want to knead the dough without those large ingredients so that the gluten can form without, being interrupted. If you had small ingredients like cinnamon or little tiny flakes of dried basil, those could go in at the beginning of the knead, but anything bigger than that, like fresh rosemary or actually even dried rosemary might be a bit much, or raisins. Basically, you knead the dough till it's fully kneaded, and then you kind of fold those ingredients in and just do a little bit of extra kneading to work them all throughout. Another thing to think about is if your ingredients are wet, like say you've got some olives and you strain them but they're still a little on the wet side, that's going to make your dough wetter, and it might end up that your bread doesn't rise as high because the dough became a little too wet. So something like that I would toss in flour to dry it out before you add it. But something like raisins that's dried out, that's going to get in your dough and it's going to soak up water, and it's going to end up making your dough a little bit dry. So something like raisins, I would rehydrate a little bit ahead of time, maybe soak them overnight and then strain the water off, or adjust your recipe, use the raisin water instead of the normal water. just so that you're not drying out your dough. So just think about what you're adding and how it might affect your recipe. I will add though that if this is the first time you've ever made bread, I would start with a plain white loaf just to get the hang of it before you start adding a lot of other ingredients, just because it's easier, and it's easier to kind of assess where it's at and learn with a basic recipe.